round of applause.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all of you for granting me the privilege of speaking to your meeting today on the subject of the miners' next step. In fact, I cannot imagine for the life of me how any miners' leader worth his salt could turn down such an opportunity to come and speak to you today. I have never in my life run away from miners. In fact, quite the opposite. I run towards them and I join them. And that has been the thing that I have lived by all my life in terms of the union. But I was thinking about this meeting, and I was reminded that as a young man, I sat down the pit and I was talking to an old union official. His name was Enoch Walker, and I'll never forget him. He was a wise old owl. And as we chatted, he gave me a piece of advice, and I will never forget it. He said, if you don't look back at history, if you don't look back at it, then you are blind in one eye. And he said, and if you don't take account of the present and look to the future, then you are blind in both eyes. And that is why I make no apology for looking back at how we came to the situation that we find ourselves in today. I do look back at history, and I look at history and learn lessons from it. On the 10th of March, 1985, Ian McGregor, a few days after the strike, speaking to the Sunday Times, made a promise to deliver a lesson to teach miners and their families the price of insubordination and insurrection. That was the promise he made. A nasty, evil, vindictive promise. We found out the full vindictive extent of that price in 1994, when the industry was privatised and the Tory government snatched half of our pension surpluses in one fell swoop. It was evil. Since then, they have helped themselves to £4.4 billion and counting. Now, I am no Johnny come lately to this fight. I've been fighting this issue for more than 30 years. My story starts in 1991, when I spoke at an NUM conference at the Winter Gardens in Blackpool, arguing for a far better deal for miners from the Mine Workers Pension Scheme. In 1992, I wrote an article in the Yorkshire Miner that got me into deep water. It's nothing new. I've always been in deep water, and after today's speech I will probably find out that I'm in a hell of a lot smaller. I wrote that the government, well really British Coal, which has been pointed out here as the same self-same thing, that British Coal had stolen 470 million from the mine workers' pension scheme. I received a letter threatening me with a libel action unless I apologised. Arthur Scargill said, apologise, not on your life. It took 4 years to get to the High Court in 1996. Arthur had got one of the world's best lawyers to represent me and the union. His name, you might have heard of him, Geoffrey Robertson QC. Fantastic lawyer. I will give you a flavour of what happened in that court. And it is only a flavour, because the secretary of the scheme, who was employed by British Coal, was in the witness box for 1.5 days. So I can't give you the whole of what went on, but I can give you a flavour. First of all, he was questioned by his own QC. That went on for possibly half an hour. And we had a jury. The jury was listening intently, but I don't think they understood a word of it. But they understood the next bit. When he came to be questioned by Geoffrey Robertson said to him, Mr. Stevens, are you aware that there are members of the mine workers' pension scheme, in particular widows, who are on less than £1 a week? He said yes. He says, and would you also be aware that there are children on less than 50 pence a week? He said, well, yes. He says, and do you believe it's morally right to take £470 million from the mine workers' pension scheme in those circumstances? Well, he had to say yes, because if he said no, the case would be lost. So he said yes. He says, are you aware, Mr. Stevens, that some of those widows were widowed because their husbands were killed in Britain's coal mines? He said, well, yes. He said, are you aware that some of those children were orphaned because their fathers were killed in Britain's coal mines? He said, yes. He says, and you still think it was morally right to take £470 million out of the scheme? He said, yes. Because he couldn't say no. He couldn't say no. He said, Mr. Stevens, let's take a look at the Yorkshire miner that offended you so much. So will you turn to the back page first? So he did. He says there it sets out the new wage rates for miners. Sets out what a face worker will get, what an outby worker will get, what a pit bottom worker will get, what a surface worker will get. Sets them all out there, doesn't it? He said yes. He said, now would you say that those wage rates are just an opinion, or are they a fact? He said, well, obviously they're a fact. He said, yes. He said, now let's compare that with something else. What if it said in the paper, Peter Lorimer stole a late goal for Leeds United? Is it a fact? Or is it just a journalist embellishing things? He says, is that reporter saying that Peter Lorimer is a thief because he stole the late goal for Leeds United? He said, well, no. He said, no. He said, so let's turn to the article that so offended you. I don't know what page it was now, but let's say it was page 4 in the Yorkshire Miner. He said, Mr. Capstick says you've stolen £470 million from the Mine Workers' Pension Scheme. He said, yes. He said, do you think that was a fact? Or do you think it was Mr. Capstick using colourful language? Well, if he opted for colourful language, he'd lost the case. So he had to go for, yes, I think he meant it as a fact. So I said, right, so that evening you get home and you're sat in your house. When you read this article, you'd have been very upset, wouldn't you, Mr. Stevens? He said, yes, I was. Mr. Capstick accused you of stealing £470 million. I said, yes. He says, and you believe that people will accept that as fact. In other words, the ordinary man in the street will think they've stolen £470 million. That's what you think. That the ordinary man in the street wouldn't think it was Mr. Capstick just using colourful language. That it was actually a fact. So he said, yes, I do believe that. Right, he said. So, the world outside believes you're a thief. Believes you've stolen £470 million from the Mine Workers' Pension Scheme. You had to say yes. Because if you said no, they lost the case. He said, right. So, did the fraud squad get in touch with you and say, Mr. Stevens, you've stolen £470 million from the Mine Workers' Pension Scheme. Where is it? He said, no. And no. He said, did the local police station give you a call and say, Mr. Stevens, you've stolen £470 million from the Mine Workers' Pension Scheme. Ken Capstick says so. Where's the money? He said, no. He said, did by any chance the local Bobby knock on your door? and say, Mr. Stevens, where's this £470 million? He said, no. He said, no. No. He says, because no one in their right mind would have believed that it was anything other than colourful language being used by Mr. Capstick. Now, the next person in the witness box was a guy called Birmingham, not Birmingham, Birmingham. And he was, I believe, some sort of a financial director for British Coal, who was also doing the same job for the Mine Workers' Pension Scheme. And he was asked a whole load of technical questions by their lawyer. Quite honestly, I think it went over everybody's head. But what happened next didn't go over everybody's head. It shocked me and Arthur. Where the hell did Geoffrey Robertson get his information from? He said, Mr. Birmingham. And this was on the Tuesday. On the Tuesday. He said, you'll be retiring soon, won't you, Mr. Birmingham? He said, yes. Yeah. Would I be right in saying you'll be retiring on Friday? He said, yes. Yeah. Would I be right in saying you'll have a pension pot of £52,000 a year? He said, yes. Robertson turned to the jury and he said, now that's better than £1 a week, isn't it? That's better than £1 a week. I've got no further questions for this man. And the judge said, Mr. Birmingham, you can step down. And he did step down and he crawled off somewhere. And that was the end of him. My position has not changed on this issue. Not one iota in the past 30 years. In 1994, the government forced an agreement onto the trustees that made the great train robbers look like petty thieves. In October last year, Mick Newton and I were invited by the MPS to attend a meeting with Ed Miliband on the 13th of November 2020. Just today, worth remembering. It was what me and Mick call the famous pincer movement on Ed Miliband. To be fair to Ed Miliband, he was very, very supportive of what we suggested, and we called for a select committee inquiry. And that's how the select committee hearing came about, through Ed Miliband. He exposed for all to see the damning condemnation and indictment of the government through that select committee inquiry. Now, there are those who call for all sorts of proportions, 70-30, 80-20, 90-10. And there are those who will say, I promise you they will, that wanting 100% is greedy. Greed. Well, let me give you the answer. Let's assume for a moment that a thief breaks into your house and steals £100 out of the drawer and makes off with it, but gets caught red-handed, with the £100 in his hand. And the police say, we're glad to inform you that we've caught the thief and we've recovered the £100. And you'll say, oh, thank you very much, when can I have my £100? And they say, oh, wait a minute, come on. Surely you're going to share it 70-30 with the thief? After all, he took a lot of risk. He took a lot of risk. And you say, wait a minute, I'm not going to share. I'm not sharing it with the thief. Well, what about 80-20? Will that do? No, it won't. 90-10. No. I want all my £100 back. I wrote a letter to the Rugeley Chronicle, the 18th of April, 2021. 9 days before the Select Committee report was published. 9 days. I wrote it on a Sunday. It was Sunday evening when I emailed it to them. I thought rather craftily, because I thought on Monday morning when they look at their letters, mine will be number one because I sent it late on Sunday evening. 9 days. But of course it wasn't published until the Friday, on the 23rd of April. And that was 4 days before the Select Committee reported back. Let me tell you what I wrote to the Rugeley Chronicle. Only if in future all surpluses are left in the scheme, along with the investment reserve and an injection of past government share of surpluses into the MPS, will we be able to provide miners and miners' widows with the financial dignity and security they deserve in old age. The Select Committee reported back 9 days after I penned my letter, and their report was bang in line with what I said to the Rugeley Chronicle. I said to the Rugeley Chronicle, you got it first. They did. There are those who say the surplus share should be, you've got to look out for what people say, what words they use, you know. That the surplus share should be revised. Revised. There should be no surplus share. Never mind revising it. What on earth do they mean? What does revised mean here? Well, we get an indication. In one submission, it was argued to the Select Committee that a 90-10 share, or even a 70-30 split of surpluses would be more appropriate. Whoever said that, what does he want? You don't know. You don't know. You don't know. Because in one breath he says 90-10, and in the next breath he says 70-30 split would be more appropriate. I don't know what he wants. But obviously anything between 90-10 and 70-30 he would be happy with.
Happy with the crumbs.
How can that be? How How can someone who doesn't know what he wants himself possibly negotiate for you? And not only that, he's told the government what he's prepared to accept. The UDM suggested that reverting back to the 70-30 split would be one way to reverse the impression of disproportionate Treasury take. 70-30. In recent times, some voices have called for 80-20, some have said 85-15 split of surpluses. The Treasury, comrades, should not take anything at all out of the surplus. So I don't know how anyone can negotiate for miners when they already have told the government that they're prepared to take less. I heard today that someone said on one of the Facebook pages, we should settle for 70-30. We don't want 100% because that would end up with us paying more tax. I mean, it absolutely beggars belief. You don't hear multimillionaires complaining about wanting to be on the same wage as a face worker. To save tax. You know? Oh, God grief. Some of the stuff that's being said on Facebook. Consider what Chris Cheetham, the MPS chairman, said. Much more interesting. What he said to the select committee, referring to the government taking money out of the pension scheme. Taking money out. Now Chris, I know him well. Chris Cheetham is an expert on pensions, and he also happens to be the chief global investment officer for the HSBC Bank. I can assure you that Chris Cheetham is nobody's fool. He said that such an arrangement is now highly unusual, if not unique. There is no current situation where sponsors take money out of the scheme that they are responsible for. And he went on to say, indeed, they cannot. Regulations do not enable it. Regulations do not enable it. In other words, the government helping itself to half of the surpluses from the scheme is in breach of regulations. The government has had to date 4.4 billion with another 1.9 billion in the pipeline. I mean, it makes anyone calling for 70-30 or 80-20 or 90-10 split of surpluses or anything other makes them look ridiculous. But what's worse, it's a kick in the teeth for you. It's a kick in the teeth for me that wants all the surplus. But it's more than that. It's a kick in the teeth for the select committee that said we should have 100% of all the surplus. my lips. I want 100% of all surpluses in line with the report. I want the return of 1.2 billion sitting in the investment reserve to give an immediate uplift to miners' pensions, and an injection into the scheme of all past surpluses received by the government in line with that called for by the Select Committee. This is in line with the cross-party Select Committee report of Tory MPs, Labour MPs, Liberal MPs, and with my letter to the Rugeley Chronicle. The past 5 years since I was elected, I've seen years of achievement for the trustees. Working together as a team, not attacking each other, but working as best we could together. We got a Select Committee report bang in line with what I wrote to the Rugeley Chronicle, almost word for word. In 2017, we achieved an inflation-busting increase to bonuses equivalent to 4.2% on the guaranteed wage until 2023. 6 years, 4.2% on bonuses equivalent to the guaranteed pension. But in September of this year, we built upon that. We built upon it. And now all bonuses are protected and can never be lost. Can never be lost. So I mean, that has been years of achievement there. But that wasn't enough. Far from enough. Not for me and Mick Newton anyway. We got a Select Committee inquiry off the ground and managed to get a damning report on the government. Mick Newton, by the way, Mick Newton has been a breath of fresh air since he became a trustee. There isn't a meeting goes by but what Mick Newton makes very telling contributions at nearly every meeting. Now we must not weaken our position or our resolve. The miner's next step, looking at history, the miner's next step was a political pamphlet produced by miners in 1912, over 100 years ago. It was calling for a change in direction from their leadership, their union leadership. It's worth noting that on my personal Facebook page, I have around twice as many miners as the NUM declares as its current official membership. This meeting, under the heading "The Miner's Next Step," is very timely in our call for change. Over a century later, nothing changes. We're still fighting the same fights, the same battles, but I'll tell you one thing we do. We look back at those miners over 100 years ago. We look back at those wonderful people. We look back at the conditions they worked in. We look back at the battles they had to fight and how hard it was, and at once we recognise brothers. And we recognise friends, even though it's over 100 years ago. Now, we want the government's response to the Select Committee. Then a period of negotiation will take place, and that could take a few weeks or a few months, so the trustees could be involved. But the meetings with the government, the wheels of government move very slow. It's not like at the pit, where if we've got a problem, we meet the manager every day. You can go weeks between meetings with these people. Meeting the government, I have learned, since I became a trustee, there can be long periods between one meeting and the next, but I think we're ready. And I know the trustees are calling for the full Select Committee inquiry to be brought into force. I do not think there is another trustee who has ever held a meeting of this kind in the history of the scheme. It isn't supposed to be the done thing, old boy. I'm prepared to come back again once this busy period is over, to discuss the scheme and talk about the strategy we use to ensure that not just today's miners receive their entitlement, but also that miners and widows, right until the day when the last miner or widow dies, receive their full entitlements, and if possibly we can get them more than we should. I will also talk about the investment strategy we use to get the money we need to pay pensions, given that we have had no other income for 27 years. Don't forget, we have had no contributions for over a quarter of a century. I haven't paid a penny in over a quarter of a century, and neither of you, because nobody, I think. The scheme was closed in 1994, and the government certainly hasn't paid a penny into the scheme in all that time. So how do we manage? How do we get by? How do we get the money to make sure we pay the pensions in the right amount, at the right time, every time? I'll tell you how we do it. We do it because we have a first-class investment team working for us. And I remember when I first started going to London, get off the lift, turn that way into a boardroom with a table that round about 17 people can sit round. Get off and go to the meeting. If you turn that way, there's an open plan office. And one day I got off an hour a bit early, and I thought, I'm going to have a wander in there. I want to see what they're doing. And I walked in, and I saw a table and a chair, and on the table was the Financial Times. I thought, I'll sit down and have a read of that. And I sat down. And those people in that open office plan made me more welcome than I've been just about anywhere else apart from here today. And that was the investment team. They are clever lads. They really are. They are investing your money all over the world, in any place where they can get the best return for your money. We invest it here in Britain, we invest it in Europe, invest it in America, invest it in China. They keep very little money that isn't invested in cash, in order that they can pay the pensions when they become due. They do not like, and they told me this, they do not like idle money not working. Any money that isn't needed immediately, they invest it. They're good lads. I found that out. So today, we have followed old Enoch's advice from many years ago. We have looked at the past to learn from the past. Then we have looked at the present situation that we are faced with. Now together, we must forge a new future in which miners and miners' widows can truly enjoy the full fruits of their labour. I am grateful for the privilege and the opportunity to speak to you today. I wouldn't have missed it for the whole world. And I hope to see you all again in the not too distant future. And thank you very much.